All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's turn time to start this workshop. I'm sure we'll have a couple of people coming a minute or two late after the break, but I'll at least start introducing myself now and give people time to come in. But if you heard my introduction this morning, you'll know that my name is Dr. Victoria Murphy, and a long time ago I actually had an engineering degree, but since that time I've kind of dipped into the murky and fuzzy world of social science, and especially focusing in on learning. And during my PhD and most recent activities, I've kind of combined that initial interest in engineering and some of the social science to think about what's learning mean in this context, and how is learning happening after you have an accident. And also, I think the question that many people have in this industry, and we've heard throughout today's different talks, people discuss measuring and data and evidence. So what does that mean when it comes to learning from incidents? Well, today we'll be doing, actually, if I move to the first slide. Today we'll be talking about exactly that topic, understanding how learning happens after an accident or a near miss, thinking about what some indicators might be that learning is happening. So how can we actually know whether learning is happening or not? And then what evidence is there for us to actually use to evaluate learning from incidents? And throughout this workshop, as it is a workshop rather than a presentation, there's going to be lots of opportunities for you to share with each other. There'll be some discussion exercises where we can think about and exchange best practices. I also just want to point out, this is an hour-long workshop, but it's actually based on this measuring learning workshop that the Energy Institute hosts on their website. I believe it's completely free to access. And this is a workshop that I wrote for them following my PhD, which was examining in depth how is learning happening and how can we actually know whether that learning is happening or not. One thing I will say as well is a lot of the techniques that we're going to use today are basically going to be breaking down into what does learning mean, and what does success look like, and then what evidence do we have as to whether that success is happening or not. And there were some discussions this morning about what does net zero mean, or how can we know if fatigue is happening? There's been lots of different discussions about slightly fuzzier topics that are really related and really important to safety. And this kind of approach can actually work quite well for things besides learning from incidents as well. So before we get into too much about the specifics, and I actually start telling you things about what I found, and we start discussing best practices with each other, I want to just give you 2 or 3 minutes just to think by yourself. How can companies know if they are learning from incidents, accidents, and near misses? This is obviously something that we'll be talking in a lot more depth over the coming hour, but just so you can start thinking about it yourself. How do you think companies can know if they're learning from incidents or not? Perhaps your organization is already doing something in this area. If not, just thinking about it based on your own experiences. How might this work? All right, I'll just give people 20 more seconds just to continue thinking about how can companies know if they're learning from incidents. Okay, so as I mentioned, basically everything that we do in this workshop from now on is going to dive deeper into this question and try and break it down into slightly more manageable bits. I actually, in my research, have asked people this question, and people are often quite stumped. Their responses are, I don't know, it's a good question. Or perhaps they, the most common answer is probably, well, if your instants are going down, then you're learning. But as we'll discuss in just a couple of slides, that's actually quite difficult in some ways. You know whether you're learning or not, but maybe not so much why you're being successful or why you're not being successful. So I think when it comes to learning from accidents and in near misses, one of the first things to think about is that there's actually two different types of learning taking place. You have what people in management schools call organizational learning. So these are updates to your processes, your procedures, perhaps your barriers and your control measures, maybe even your technology. So these are things that are going to affect the way that teams across your organization do their job. Perhaps you've learned that, as we were talking earlier about different types of turbine blades, perhaps a particular type of turbine blade caused an incident. So you change it to one that's easier, like going to avoid having the same event happen again. And these are very good changes because they're sustainable. You can have an entire workforce changeover, but then when the new people come in to start doing the same jobs and procedures, these processes, these barriers, these technology, they're going to guide all of the way that people do their job in the future. So it's a very sustainable type of learning. I can remember hearing a talk as well about how behavior can actually drive culture. We often think about culture driving behavior, but it also has an impact on the culture. People start thinking about safety perhaps more. I remember when I first started visiting energy companies and had to hold the handrail every time I went up or downstairs. It started changing the way that I thought about what was an acceptable risk and not. And it's like, well, this is such an easy thing to do. Of course, it's something I'll do. And so the more safety you start putting in your procedures and processes, the more it's made explicit, that can start driving cultural change, which is another way of sustainably learning. But there's also, if we think back to, I think both myself and Lorraine had that process diagram of what learning from incidents involves, from reporting an incident or learning about an incident from another industry or another organization, and then summarizing it into an incident alert or a return on experience, and then sending that around the entire organization so people can learn from the experiences of others. You can think about how that relates to your own context, your own work. So this takes place a lot of the time in toolbox talks or safety learning sessions. And one of the real advantages of this is everybody can learn from the experiences of others. Like, you don't need to experience an incident yourself. And I've actually surprised, I've not heard this word used too much during this conference, but it's actually quite good, this approach for building a resilient workforce, by constantly asking people to think actively about what they're doing and whether a similar kind of incident could occur. People are slowly developing their knowledge of hazards and their knowledge of the procedures and the reasons that procedures are built a certain way. So if something does go wrong, they understand the situation better and can actually, adapt and adjust and avoid an incident that way. So this individual learning is quite important for building a resilient workforce. And again, it's starting to have a safety-oriented culture where you're talking about safety, and safety is seen as something that's valuable and something to be actually taken seriously and to put effort into. So the model of learning that we're going to talk about, or the way that we're going to think about learning in the next 45 minutes or so, is this one here. This is a model of learning that's come from academic research, but it's been used in a lot of different situations where learning is important. And it basically breaks down learning into 4 different parts. You have and I think this is the most natural way of thinking about learning in some ways. You have the learning outcomes. So these are the changes that you want to achieve. If we think back to when I ask people, how do you know if learning is happening or not? The idea of the number of incidents going up or down, well, that's something that you want to achieve, right? That's a specific outcome that will demonstrate quite concretely that learning is happening. And that's what we, in this model, we're calling a hard learning indicator. But I often, well, in my spare time, I like to grow vegetables. I have an allotment. And at the end of the season, I'll know whether or not my cucumbers or my beans have grown. But it's not always clear to me why. And that's one of the downsides of focusing only on the outcome, on what you want to happen. Often you'll know whether you've been successful or not, but you won't know why you were successful. And in the worst case scenario, if let's say the number of incidents are rising, or you suddenly, after a period of no incidents, have a major incident, you won't know why that happened. Was it that you weren't learning well in the first place? Well, you weren't looking at any of the things that were going on. So you have no insight into what you can do better next time. So that's what these soft learning indicators are about. They're more about the process, what's happening as time goes on. So to go back to that analogy of gardening, maybe I'll take readings about the soil pH, or I could have been making it, marking how the weather is. These different things will not completely dictate whether learning has happened or not. It's not as clean an indicator as looking at whether a vegetable grew or not, or whether the incident rate is going down or not. But they're really giving me a lot of insight into some of the factors that really matter. And if they're not there, learning is definitely not happening. So the first one of these that we're going to talk about is learning activities. So this is thinking about, what are people doing to learn? If we go back to that organizational level, incident investigations are a way of learning, talking about what recommendations should come following the incident investigation, actually implementing those recommendations. That's all a type of learning activity. What is important during that learning activity are basically soft learning indicators. So what is it that's going to lead to a good incident investigation? What does it mean that the recommendations are being implemented well? What's necessary for that? And likewise, if we go back to that individual kind of lens of learning, what's necessary? What do people need to be doing in order to be learning well? And what are maybe the qualities that are associated with that learning? Things like, are we talking openly? Do people have good instance alerts to be discussing? Then we've also got organizational factors and personal knowledge and attributes and behaviors. So we'll actually go for the personal knowledge, behaviors, and attributes. If you think about a student in a classroom, if you're a teacher standing at the front, I was a teacher at one point, and you know which students are going to do well in their exams way before it happens. And it's things like, are they motivated? If you think about maths class, I'm sure there's quite a few engineers here. So maths is something where you need to have like a building of knowledge. So if somebody doesn't understand the basic concepts, then they're not going to do well in that class, because they don't have enough knowledge and understanding to be able to understand really what's happening. So this is to do with the learners in this case. What do they need in order to be able to learn properly? And then there's also the organizational factors. Learning is actually something that takes quite a lot of effort. So is time being set aside? Are the right structures? I spoke this morning about training supervisors. We've also spoken about the role of leadership. All of these kind of more organizational factors, which are going to affect how well those learning activities happen, and then how well those learning outcomes actually are achieved. So to give a little bit more context, again, personal knowledge, behaviors, and attitudes. For example, it might be, do workers have relevant knowledge? Are workers motivated to learn? Do workers have relevant skills? Organizational factors. So is leadership showing support for learning? Are resources available to help learning? the organizational culture supporting learning, and then workers communicating openly for learning activities, or maybe we spoke a lot about cognitive biases this morning. Are workers actually thinking deeply about an incident? And then we have at the bottom the hard indicators of learning. So these are the concrete changes, which are perhaps a little bit easier to picture how you might measure them. So what I'm going to ask you to do in this first exercise is put this in the chat, and then I'll actually go back to the previous slide as well, just while you're thinking about this. But I'd like you to start thinking about what might this look like in your company. What are some hard indicators that you want learning from incidents to achieve? But what are some of those softer indicators? What's necessary for learning to be happening, either through what's something that related to the activities that should be happening, or what do you need in terms of personal characteristics for learning to be happening, or what do you need from the organization to support that learning process? So again, I'll give you a couple of minutes, and I'm actually going to put a copy of the slide from the previous, or a copy of the previous slide in the chat as well. And just in case, so that worksheet is now in this chat, and just in case you need it, I'll also come back to this, which has some examples. So I'll just give you maybe one more minute to think about this, and then we're going to continue in probably not a breakout room. How many people do we have here? Yeah, I think there's enough of us here that it'd be better just to discuss it as a single group, the different ideas that we've had for these categories.
Sorry, Victoria, did you pop something in the chat? I can't see anything.
Ah, that's because I've just sent it to Vicky only, who was messaging me earlier. Hold on, let me just upload that again. To be honest, it was only if you're going to go into breakout rooms that you'll need it. Otherwise, it's basically just this slide.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's hear what people were thinking. And maybe if we start with some hard indicators of learning, what are the actual outcomes that you want to result from learning from incidents? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Does anyone have any ideas on that?
Hi, Vicky, this is Matthew. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Something that I thought of when you said, what would it look like earlier? The first question to think about, I was thinking, you want to avoid repeat incidents or repeat near misses. Would that be one of those concrete changes? Or is that more?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I'll actually, in a couple of slides, I'll show you, because I did this research, I asked a lot of professionals such as yourselves, and that was one of the ones that was mentioned there. So absolutely, you would, it's not just the number of incidents going down, but it's specifically the number of repeated incidents that you'd want to see decreasing. So great idea. Anyone else, anything else that they think learning from incidents should be achieving?
It's Lincoln here. I think it would, you've got to make sure that actions from incidents actually get implemented. So there's the learning about why things are happening, but also changes to processes or equipment being made.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think if you read the academic literature from this, that actually seems to be the hardest point. You get the recommendations, and then some of the easy ones get ticked off, and then there's kind of a lag where perhaps some of the harder things never get achieved because something else suddenly pops up that takes priority. So that would definitely be a kind of indicator, and quite an easy one to measure how many of the things that we're saying we should do actually get done. Okay. Any other ideas perhaps about the harder indicators, these outcomes that you want, but perhaps also about what needs to be there for good learning activities to take place, or good organizational factors, or good personal knowledge, behaviors, and attitudes.
Hi, Victoria, it's Kurt.
Hi, Kurt.
Well, from a hard indicator, I would kind of say also the number of processes that have been updated, and that could reflect how an organization is actually learning from what went wrong in the past, if you want to put it that way. And as an organizational factor, as a soft indicator, the first thing I'd written down was actually time. Organization needs to make sufficient time to allow people to actually perform a deep dive into an incident. If time is lacking, then probably it's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a fantastic example of one of those. It's almost like necessary but not sufficient conditions. If you're not setting any time aside for people to learn from incidents, or for investigations to take place, and what Lincoln mentioned for those, I guess, follow-up actions, if there's no time for any of that, definitely learning's not taking place. It doesn't really matter if you look at the outcomes. If there's no time, it's not happening. Okay. Any other thoughts?
Hi, Vicky, it's Matthew again. I was reminded, it's sort of a suggestion and a question, but I remember working with an organisation about how they would run a workshop or an exercise to think about how could an incident happen in a particular workplace, and they suggested that rather than just thinking how getting the group of people thinking about it, so I guess this is in a learning activity, rather than just asking people how could that incident happen here, but how could maybe something similar happen in the workplace, and also saying what are multiple scenarios for that thing or a similar thing happening, to try and really get people to think about it in a deeper way, rather than just sort of dismissing it and saying that can't happen here because we don't have gas turbines, we get our power from diesel generators or something like that. I think that was their example, and I was wondering, is that something you'd put in that right hand box of learning activities as an example?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, perhaps now I'll just move on to this is what I found. I spoke to a lot of people about times that they'd had good learning experiences, or when a major incident had happened, what had happened afterwards, because you would expect there to have been learning, both in terms of what the organization did and what that meant for them as an individual as well. And what you were just talking about there, Matthew, I would say that's kind of impactful delivery. People often spoke about the way it was not just what the incident is what happened in it and what the recommendations were, but it's how are you engaging with that information? How are you actually thinking about it? Is this something we can learn from, or as you were saying then, are there multiple ways that we can actually think about this? What really are the lessons for us that similar incidents could actually have lessons for us from? So just to kind of very briefly go over some of this, a lot of the personal behaviors and attitudes and knowledge that people mentioned were things like drive to improve. If people aren't motivated to change or to improve, again, it doesn't really matter what your learning outcomes show or what learning activities are. That's going to be a problem. Do people have the knowledge and skills related to procedures? I think one of my favorite examples of learning that came up was somebody who was talking about, they were actually discussing an example where something hadn't happened because it was an example of good practice. Somebody had dealt with a hazard in the correct way, and the person I was talking to, interviewing, said, "Oh, I realized as he was saying this that I hadn't actually known the procedure properly. That I'd actually broken this procedure before, but now I know how to do it better. And I also understand the reasons behind that procedure." And that kind of goes to the learning outcomes down at the bottom here. improved knowledge of procedures. Safety mindset was something people spoke about quite a lot, and linked to that was risk perception. If, again, it's kind of all going on to motivation when it comes to the personal behaviors and attitudes. If people don't think they're working in a dangerous environment, either because perhaps they never really understood that, or perhaps over time risk normalization has happened. Again, these are things that are going to impact how well people are able to engage with learning. Organizational factors. So there's things here like communication. What's the communication infrastructure? Transparency in decisions. Safety as an organizational value, which really links to leadership. And then learning activities, open communication. The information quality was something people spoke about quite a lot. The instant alerts we're receiving / the investigation reports that are going to leadership and the teams that are going to be implementing changes, do they contain enough information, or do they contain too much information so it's impossible to actually get to any specific points? And monitoring, auditing as well was something people spoke about in terms of a learning activity. And then like a lot of the things that here for the learning outcomes we just said, so changes to official procedures, that's something we could count quite easily. Improved knowledge of hazards, no repeated instance, which is what Matthew mentioned, and then perhaps the reduction in total number of incidents. So these were the different ways, and I think this just shows how learning is something that I think a lot of people feel like they have an intuitive knowledge about, but in reality, when you start breaking it down, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And especially when it's outside of schools, when we're talking about real learning in real workplaces, it's actually quite open to interpretation. So probably what you're thinking at this point as you're looking is like, wow, that's a lot of different things. There's about 20 different things, and I would call each of these a potential indicator of learning. So it's either a hard indicator that is evidence that changes definitely happened, or perhaps an indicator that change is likely to be happening. And this is a lot, and I don't recommend that you go away from this talk and decide to try and get data on every single one of these. This is more of just a chance to reflect on which of these does your company currently think about in terms of learning, and which of these do you actually have any kind of evidence on? Which leads me nicely to my next slide. I think when we're thinking about how to measure or evaluate learning from incidents, the key is to pick a couple of things that we think really matter. Some of those things from the hard indicators, perhaps the changes we really want to happen. And also then some of those softer indicators, things that we think are really important for our organization. You know, you yourself know the way that learning is set up. Learning from incidents specifically is set up in your organization. What are some of the things that are really key in those processes? And then once you've decided what these key potential indicators are, you can start thinking about, okay, what evidence do we actually have to evaluate this as an indicator? And this is where I think the social sciences actually helps a little bit. When I was doing my engineering degree, I can't call myself an engineer, I was never practicing, but everything revolves around numbers. So if you look here, that's kind of the middle one of these different types of evidence. Everything revolves around numbers. If you couldn't put a number on it, then it didn't matter. I think it was Einstein who said, though, that a lot of the things that count are uncountable. And that's kind of one of the problems with some of it. We go back a couple of slides to this. Some of these things, it's not easy to put numbers to it. Some of them will have, I guess, easy to understand values that you could measure, but not all of them that matter. So that's where the other two different things come in, investigation or personal stories. So if you think about when an incident's happened, often an investigator will interview the people who were involved, the people who actually know what happened and have some insight into it. Because I mean, you could send out a survey and ask everybody to rate, you know, how likely they think different things could have been, but actually talking to people and hearing that qualitative detail is really useful. And if you're thinking about evaluating your learning, for instance, systems and processes, one thing you might want to do is think about who might know something about how well it's going, and who would be willing to share that in an honest way, perhaps not with myself, but perhaps if we ask somebody else to gather that data. So personal stories can actually be really insightful, especially if we're thinking about those soft indicators of why is learning happening or not. Written documents as well. So obviously, if we're thinking about that impactful delivery, the incident alert is one thing that's quite important to think about. What's that you could use to evaluate whether learning is happening or not. And more actually with analytics, you can get all kinds of, you can transform those written documents into numbers. So how many words are there in the average incident alert? How many of them are really technical? How many recommendations are there? You could even rate recommendations based on how deeply are they considering causes. But I think, see, for Kurt or Lincoln, who mentioned that the number of actions that are being taken, and you'll have this incident report, and with the recommendations, and often depending on the complexity of the incident, it'll be quite a long list. But you could go back and actually look at, okay, this is what we recommended. Did this get achieved? And those written documents can be quite useful in terms of gathering evidence for whether something is happening or not. And again, if you were thinking about, I think it was Lincoln who mentioned the changes in procedures. I mean, that's something, again, that would be captured within the written documents and you could use as evidence that learning has happened. One of the other things that I wanted to just take a second to do, and we've had quite a few academic presentations today, and what tends to happen in academia is you'll take something that's a little bit fuzzy around the edges, something like learning. And then to make it more understandable and to kind of get from that discussion of what does it mean for net zero? Well, this is what I think, and this is what I think, or what is sustainability? You'll start breaking it down into things that you all agree on. Of, okay, so it's learning is the changes in the changes that we expect to see. Learning is also, are we creating the right environment for learning to take place, the organizational factors. And then you'll take that organizational factors and you'll break it down further into even more specific things. So you're starting to take this fuzzy thing and then break it down slowly into little bits that actually are more concrete. So organizational factors on this slide is broken down into transparency, into safety as an organizational value, and into company strategy, perhaps. And then you could break down safety as an organizational value into thinking like, well, if safety is an organizational value, what would I expect to see? What would I actually see if this was true? It might be that the refinery manager is the person who sends emails about incidents. It's actually coming from senior management rather than just being cascaded, or in the worst case, no, you never hear about the incidents or the follow-up to the incidents that's taking place. If safety is an organizational value, you would expect it to be recognized in appraisal systems. If safety is an organizational value, perhaps it's something that you expect meetings to start with. And safety as an organizational value is quite difficult to think about what evidence there might be or might not be for it. But when you start to break it down in this way, it becomes a little bit easier to think about what each of these bits might mean, and what evidence you could collect for each of those, either through, again, perhaps something one-off like talking to somebody who actually knows what's happening on the front line quite well, or perhaps looking at the documents, or, I mean, is it written somewhere the meeting should be starting with safety, or collecting some numbers. How many toolbox talks are happening? How many incidents are discussed? So what we're going to do for the rest of the workshop is think quite specifically about one indicator that I spoke about, which is open communication. A while ago, some researchers actually looked at the academic literature on safety culture and learning culture and concluded there's a lot of overlap. There are some differences, but open communication is something that's really important in any kind of culture, really. So it's something that we're going to start focusing in on now. And my question to you is, just take 3 minutes. We're actually doing quite well for time because we've not been breaking, had the extra time that comes with going into breakout rooms. So spend 3 to 5 minutes. I'll give you a little bit longer now, just to think about open communication. What evidence could you actually have that open communication is happening, that there is open communication? And again, think about who might know something about this, who might be able to give you their personal story about this. What numbers might you be able to collect about open communication? And what written documents might there be that might show that open communication is important? And again, this is still, in my mind, actually, open communication is kind of tangible and still yet quite fuzzy. So you might need to break it down into some smaller steps, depending on what you think success would look like with this particular thing. So I'll give people 5 minutes, perhaps until 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock finish time, 4 o'clock in the UK, to think about this. And then we'll come back as a group and we'll talk about what ideas people came up with. Okay, so you've had 5 minutes to think about what evidence you could find on whether open communication is happening or not. Very curious to hear what you've come up with. I think we said at the beginning, this workshop would hopefully be an opportunity to share best practices. But I'm very curious if any organizations are thinking about how do we know if people are communicating openly or not. So does anyone have any initial thoughts? Okay, I can see on the chat, Lee has said, are the findings and lessons learned from incident investigations shared across the workforce? This is a really good point. When I've been working with, researching organizations, this is often something that the front line mention, is that they don't always hear back, especially from incidents that are happening within their company. It's kind of like maybe a one-off that this has happened, but they don't get updates on how things are happening. And sometimes it can feel like the organization is trying to hide something. So that's something almost at the organizational level that's going to dictate whether people actually think. And again, that's something that you can get evidence of quite easily. Any other thoughts? Either from the chat or speaking on the mic.
Well, I think surveys are a quite important tool to kind of measure how an organization is either performing or an organization is evolving. With then, of course, specific questions around, are your supervisors actively listening to you? Do you have trust in your direct supervisor or in your senior management? I think that type of questions gives an organization quite a good idea on how they are performing and how they are kind of setting or creating an environment that allows for open communication.
Yeah, excellent points, Kurt. And I think the Hearts and Minds tools, so as I mentioned, this is one workshop within that family. They have a couple of different surveys that you can use that might be a good place to start looking for questions along those lines as well. There's a learning from instance questionnaire specifically, which will have some questions on that. And Matthew probably can speak to this better than I can. But I think the cultural survey also, or safety culture survey, probably also has some along those lines as well.
Yeah, that's right, Vicky. It definitely would. It's interesting. I was thinking along those lines, thinking about how to answer your question, and one of the things I was thinking about is if there's and this is what people tell you about when you're talking about culture, if there's a decision that's made by leadership that might have an impact on safety and operations, evidence that there's open communication would be where that decision is clearly communicated and explained why that was made, and if there is an impact on, the operation, the organization, that's carefully messaged, because if it's not clearly communicated and openly communicated, then people will make up the story about it. So thinking back to your slide with the hexagons, that could, if it's not clearly communicated and openly communicated, that could create stories which are not necessarily true, but will then have an impact on what people do, in their work.
Yep, exactly. Stories are so important. It's how I think the human brain actually understands things. And if you were thinking back to those hexagons, so that would be a good example of a time when it would be appropriate perhaps to go to someone on the front line and be like, what's your understanding about the reason for this? Yeah, that would be quite informative to how well that decision had actually been explained. You could also look at perhaps the email that went out about it, and use that as evidence for whether it actually spoke about the decisions and the rationale behind it as well. I just want to, Hannah's had this chat in the chat for a while. It's, are employees speaking to you in whatever role you're in? That's an interesting one. So again, if we're thinking about what kind of evidence there might be for us employees speaking to you in whatever role, you might choose some people who safety concerns you would expect in a culture of open communication that it would be raised to, and then just go and ask them. You know, perhaps your team leaders, how many safety concerns have been brought up to you recently, or health and safety managers, how many people have actually things. What an easy metric for that might be the number of incident reports submitted. I know incident reports are actually very difficult to interpret, because too many, does that mean that you have a really open culture of communication, or does it mean that you're having a lot of incidents? Too few, are the incidents being hidden, or is it that you have a great communication of open culture, a great culture of open communication, so all the issues have been taken care of?
I think I wrote down quality of incident reports on my my notes there, because I think it's very dependent on the quality of those reports, whether it's something, you know, very trivial or whether it's something more minor. You know, all types of incidents almost need to be reported. And another kind of, I guess it's an example of closed communication more than anything, but you tend to notice in workplaces frustrated people that where messages haven't got across to them because there isn't an open communication. And I think that's quite an important maybe metric to be able to evidence that, albeit a very difficult to collect metric. But you can tend to feel and sense these things.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. Sometimes, especially when you're, I teach a course on managing uncertainty, which is very relevant to safety, and that's one of the talking points on that course. Of sometimes you actually need to trust your gut, and you can feel things even if you can't find numeric evidence. And if we think about those different types of evidence, actually, sometimes the leaders' stories about that they tell themselves, or maybe team leaders' stories, these are really their gut feelings about whether there's open communication or not, are really important types of evidence. And it's something I think, especially people with engineering training, I find are very quick to dismiss anything without numbers in it. But when you're talking about very intangible things, sometimes those stories and those gut feelings are actually really important in actually thinking whether something's happening or not. I also want to say your point about the details, and when you're looking at perhaps the number of things submitted, are they about very small things? So it's almost not just the number of incident reports being submitted, but also the quality of them as well. And kind of goes back almost to what Matthew was saying as well about the quality of communication coming from the top down. That's more like the quality of the communication going from the bottom up. We have our safety regulator actions shared across the workforce. Lee, can you, perhaps in the chat, but perhaps on microphone if you're feeling comfortable with that, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Okay, there's silence there. So I'm going to assume probably Lee is probably, oh, I have a heavy cold, but our regulatory notice is shared. So again, I think that's going down to the kinds of information that's being sent down to the front line. And again, that's something that's quite easy to find evidence on. You can have email trails and see who's sending what kinds of information. Our regulatory notice is actually being shared around the company. I also, and Matthew's mentioned here, the ratio of incidents to near misses to safety concerns may tell you something. Yeah, again, that's going back to the point before about is what kinds of incidents are people actually reporting. So it's not just the number, but perhaps the quality, and then one measure of the quality could be the ratio between safety concerns to near misses to incidents. All of these different things are different types of evidence that you could collect to give you some insight into what's happening in your organization and whether open communication is is actually happening or not. It's
What I could tell you is what people have said to me in my work is some things you can't hide. So they get reported no matter what. But then there's other things where people have a choice to report them or not. And you know, I don't want you know, the safety triangle might be in the past now, but in terms of looking at it in terms of the ratio of the numbers, there's the things at the top are unhideable, because you know, if somebody's injured or there's been a big release of product, or you know, whatever process safety indicator you have. But then the things further down, there's a bit of a choice there in terms of whether people report them or not. So if you've got a safety triangle, or if you don't have a safety triangle, you've got a safety pencil, if you like, then you know, that might give you an indication of whether there's open reporting, which is part of communication, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very well put, Matthew. I completely agree. I remember someone telling me once, this was about safety culture rather than open communication, but it's very easy to have a safety culture where everybody is acting safely, where you know, when there's others around and people are watching. But like in a good safety culture, in the middle of the night when nobody is watching, are people still making the safe choices? That's what really tells you whether you have a good safety culture or not. And I guess it's the same with open communication. Yes, if something really big is that you know you can't hide has happened and you report it, that doesn't tell you too much about the open communication in some ways, as much as if people have a choice, or if they decide actually maybe this one doesn't need to make it into a system. All right, any other thoughts about anything that might show and be evidence that open communication is happening? Well, I have one more to share. So you'll have a slight opportunity to think of anything else before we perhaps wrap up this part of the workshop. But in one of the companies I was working with, when I was talking to the front line and listening to their stories, it's effectively what interviews are doing. They're collecting stories and trying to make sense of perhaps multiple people's stories. What really struck me was that people knew how to report incidents, but they didn't know how to find out what had happened to an incident that they'd reported. I spoke to some of the managers in that company, and there should have been ways of finding that out. But from the workers' perspective, and I guess this is what Matthew was talking about earlier with stories as well, from the workers' perspectives, it was completely opaque. So there was no open communication happening from the organization's side, because they reported an incident and then it kind of went into a black hole where they had no idea what was happening to it. So how visible is that process? How easy is it for people to actually find out what happens after they report an incident? And also, are there easy systems to do that? And also, do people know about those easy systems? There was kind of a gap there between what actually the organization had put in place for workers, because they could go to the system, I was told. I didn't actually see the system, so I didn't check this. But certainly the perception on the front line and the story that they told them was that there was no way to check on. So it was kind of out of their control, and they just had to wait with this heavy feeling on their heart. Hannah says here, both positive and negative feedback. I think that's also an important point. And it depends on what you're talking about. But if we think about, for example, those instant learning sessions, so those safety sessions or toolbox talks, is the feedback that actually goes up to the people making them? Do the frontline actually have those communication pathways to provide positive or negative feedback? And likewise as well, from the other direction, communication is a two-way thing. So are there ways that both positive and negative feedback are shared with the front line as well about incidents? Do you celebrate? You could even take that as look at the incidents that are discussed during toolbox talks or safety sessions? How many of them are positive, and how many like positive examples of somebody avoiding an incident? And how many of them are negative examples of an incident happening? So I'll give you one last pause in case anybody else has anything to say on this topic of how can you know whether open communication is happening or not? Okay. Right, then I'll just kind of summarize at the end. What we've just done is as I was saying, we've basically broken down what does learning mean. Okay, learning means that procedures and policies are being put in place. Learning means that individuals are talking about incidents. It also means that they're reporting incidents. That's the first step for either organizational or individual types of learning. It means that individuals are actually engaging deeply with incident summaries, incident alerts. We've broken it down into lots of different potential indicators that are important for whether learning has happened or is in process of happening, is likely to happen. And then just as a group now, we've thought of so many different forms of evidence that could be used to investigate and try and understand are we in a culture that has open communication about incidents? The hard part is sometimes, as I said with the previous slide, 20 indicators of learning is too much. We have limited cognitive capabilities as individuals, but as organizations as well. If we focus on too many things, it's like having an instant with 50 recommendations. Unless you devote a lot of time and energy to that, not all those 50 recommendations will be actually implemented. And if you try and use 20 different indicators, which each have like 6 or 7 different pieces of evidence for you to assess them against them as your way of understanding and evaluating how well learning from incidents is happening, that's going to be too much as well. So the key is to think about, for your company, what processes are you doing and what's important? What are you really trying to achieve, and what's important in making that learning happen? Given that, what is going to be the best kind of evidence? What's actually going to give you real insight into it? We spoke already about the number of incident reports. That's kind of where we started. And then we got 2 or 3 steps down to something that would actually give us a much better understanding. It's a higher quality source of evidence for that. So I think we took more than 10 minutes for that. We are pretty much spot on time, which is good. So I'm going to end this workshop by saying, if in the full workshop we actually do this with groups, and you think about different pieces of evidence that you could have for a couple of different indicators that your group thinks is important, and then we go on to actually also think about, well, is this good evidence? Is it telling us something meaningful about that indicator? And also, how is it actually being used? Are we collecting that evidence at the moment? If we are collecting it, is it actually being used to improve things at all? Yeah, there's a lot of, as I think science and engineering companies love collecting data, but sometimes it can just, collecting data, collecting evidence, sometimes it can just kind of stay there without actually being used for anything meaningful. So that's what the full workshop entails. Please take a look. And I'm just going to leave you with these 3 questions, reflective questions. So in the beginning of this workshop, I asked you to think about, how can you know if learning is happening in your organization following an accident or an incident or a near miss? Has your opinion changed on measuring learning, or on how you can know if learning is happening or not? Ideally, after this, you've probably got one of the better understandings in your company now of what learning means and what kind of evidence might be useful in that evaluation. So, and you also know your organization very well. So what is the next steps your organization should perhaps take to have a better understanding of how effective this learning from incidents process that I think all energy companies are investing a lot of time and money into? What's the next step in understanding how well that process is happening for your organization? And then finally, what is the next step you should be taking? Following this workshop, you've decided perhaps what your organization needs to do next. How are you going to kind of be the first person to take that step towards that? And that's 3 questions for you to think about on your own. We've come to the end. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed the discussions, some great ideas, and I'm really impressed by how many different types of evidence we managed to come up with around open communication. Also, just want to say that's also a really good demonstration of the power of bringing in different people from multiple perspectives. Okay, excellent. And I'll see everyone back in the main room.
Thank you.